Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Neutrality Studies. Today, I am joined by Commodore Steve Jermy, a retired British Navy officer. We want to discuss the general situation in international politics. So, Steve, welcome.
Very, very, great pleasure to be here, Pascal. I follow your work a lot, and I particularly like the title of Neutrality Studies because we ought to be talking a lot more about neutrality and a lot less about war.
People often think neutrality means doing nothing, but it's the exact opposite. It means doing a lot and trying, at the end of the day, not to end up in war, which I think should be the job of all and any military people. And you, as a former Navy officer, and you commanded ships, and as a Commodore, you commanded several ships. What is your analysis of what's currently going on? In my view, things are just falling apart left and right. I feel like a little sugar cube that's kind of dissolving in water because there's so many problems at the same time. Venezuela, Iran, EU sanctions, British sanctions, the genocide in Palestine, and so many things. How are you making sense of everything?
I've been sort of seeing it and sort of expecting it like this for a few years, Pascal. When I left the Navy in 2010, I had just about completed a book which I called Strategy for Action. It's not a plug for the book because it's not in print at the moment, although I'm hoping to get a second print. And what I was trying to do in the book was to get over a problem which I'd seen, which was the West appears appallingly bad at doing strategy. And at the time, we were struggling in Afghanistan and Iraq, and since then we've had Libya, Syria, and now the Russia-Ukraine war, and finally Venezuela. And it seems to me that there's no evidence of much strategic thinking in any of those. What I had missed, though, were other things. I was fortunate because the Navy sent me off for a year to Cambridge in the 90s, and I did an MPhil in international relations. I'm not nowhere near your level of erudition, but I do have a really good feel for economics, international law, and the theory of international relations. I'm sort of very much the realist camp, I suppose, although perhaps not quite as not as defined as John Mearsheimer is, although I'm a great fan of his work. I think there are three things going on in the world, and I've been thinking this since about 2015, when I was beginning to see in my second career, which is in the energy sector, a close relationship between energy and geopolitics and all these other things. So I think the first thing is that we're seeing this shift from a unipolar world, but not to a multipolar world, rather to a tripolar world. And it seems to me that we have now three great powers operating. The first is obviously the United States, the second is China, and the third is Russia. And what's interesting about those three powers is that two of them are operating on different industrial stroke economic models to the United States. I'm a great fan of Michael Hudson's work. I don't know if you've come across him. I'm sure you have. But he talks about the difference between industrial capitalism and financial capitalism. I think we in the West have been shifted onto the financial capitalism model, and whereas the Chinese and the Russians are very much in the industrial capitalism model. I wrote an article about would have been about 6 months ago, Pascal, in which I talked about the balance of power. I was actually doing it in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war, but in the balance of power article, I suggested, and this is a slight advance, I think, of John Mearsheimer's work, that the critical issues in terms of military power were twofold. The first was industrial capacity, and the second was energy. And I'm sort of stand by that analysis. And what we're starting to see, I think, is on a higher level, is we're starting to see that we know that Russia has very strong industrial capacity, as indeed has China. And we know that America would like stronger industrial capacity because it's trying to reindustrialize. So I think the balance of power between these three actors is important. This shifts the first bit of it. But I think the other two things are going on, perhaps more subtle. The first one is that the global economy does not look in good shape to me. And I think there are a lot of indicators. We know that the Western nations are heavily indebted, particularly the United States. There are issues going on within the euro-dollar sector. I'm invested in gold and silver and shocked about how quickly it's moving. Now, that might be good for me because I'm invested in it, but actually, to me, it's the canary in the coal mine. So I think what we're seeing is really interesting problems with the economics, and probably we're going to see. If I think, as I think there will be, I would not be at all surprised if there's another great financial crisis this year, perhaps next year, and it could be of a greater impact than the one in 2007, 2008. And I think if that plays out, it would not surprise me at all, for reasons which I'll come on to, that it would have led us into a great deep recession, but possibly a depression. So that's the way I've been thinking about it. I first sort of introduced these ideas in a lecture in Oxford in about 2015. But the third thing that's going on, I think this is fundamental, is that we're at the period of peak oil. And peak oil is the period where actually energy hydrocarbon supplies maximize and then start to decrease. It comes from the thinking of Marion Hubbard King, who was the great oil geologist who forecast in 1956, I think it was, that American oil supplies would peak in 1971. They did, although there was subsequently been a shale oil spike, although that won't last long. He also forecast that global oil supplies will peak around about 2010. The best evidence that I've seen is that this happened at around about 2017. My go-to person on this is a guy called Art Berman, who's a petroleum geologist working in the States. He's brilliant. And he too, I think, understands this. The reason that energy and economics are important is that there is a mathematical correlation between the use of energy and economic growth, and the correlation is close to 1. So it follows that actually, if we are indeed at peak oil and energy supplies start to reduce, and I think that'll happen from about 2030, then at that stage we cannot grow economies. It's not a terribly good idea anyway, but we cannot grow economies. So I think we're starting to move to a world which was of increasing prosperity and increasing energy supplies to one in which we're talking about decreasing prosperity and decreasing energy supplies. And I just think that explains a lot of the fractiousness that's going on around the world. It's quite subtle and underneath, but the model seems to work for me.
Hey, very brief intermission because I was recently banned from YouTube, and although I'm back, this can happen anytime again. So please consider subscribing not only here, but to my mailing list on Substack. That's pascalotta.substack.com. The link's going to be in the description below, and now back to the video. At the same time, though, we see how a lot of the political actions taken in, especially in Europe, and I include Britain, of course, in the European continent, are so harmful. They're so harmful to the self. So many of these decisions. And maybe I just would like to benefit a little bit from your experience as a ship captain and a Commodore. I mean, if you are on a ship and you cannot immediately turn the thing around, you cannot immediately go into reverse and just park as you wish, right? You need to do a little bit of planning in order to land at the place where you want to be. I mean, how is it possible that we see things like, especially the Germans shooting themselves in both feet with Nord Stream 2, with their energy dependence on the US, but also Britain that seems to be joined at the hip to the United States, even when it really, really hurts. And we've seen that. We've seen how Keir Starmer was humiliated in the Oval Office by Donald Trump, and he just sat there and shrugged his shoulders and It's like, how do you explain this to yourself? And if you as a captain, how are you thinking about the steering of large groups of people?
I think what you're pointing towards is a crisis of leadership in the West, and I think that runs across almost all Western countries, with one or two exceptions. I think one of the problems is that I've been trying to think about this, like you, no doubt, for years, and I think actually we've got into this stage where actually what I can see is evidence of what I can best describe as cult thinking in the Western elites, and that cult thinking is in part based on hubris, because actually we continue to think that the West are the good guys and that we are successful, having won the Cold War. That's an open question, of course. The other thing I think you see was a lot of, I think, is the culture of political spin. And so that things need to be spun so that you can win your particular election. But the problem is that political spin leads to deception, because the information that is provided to populations is at best partial. I don't. There will no doubt be cases where Western leaders are lying to their populations, which I think is probably. I'd like to think that's in the minority, but I think there are a lot of times where actually the public of our populations are being deceived, and they're being deceived because they're only given a partial sight of the picture, because it doesn't suit leaders politically to actually expose the whole picture. I think we can see that in the Russia-Ukraine war. It's obvious to people like me and to you and to others that actually the Russia-Ukraine war cannot be won, and yet European leaders continue on. It's a bit like having European leaders in the Titanic and continue on driving the Titanic to create even bigger holes against the iceberg of Russia's military and industrial capacity. I think actually it is all going to come apart. I think the problem though is that when I talk to the elite, certainly in my country, I would say that 90% of them actually believe it. So it's quite a struggle, because they believe it, and because the mainstream media believe it as well. And then all that the public are fed with is this same narrative. I said about, I think about.
How about your circle of Navy friends and colleagues, the people you know? Do they believe that in that circle too? Are we at around 90%?
I would say that of the former senior naval officers who I know, I would say about 90% of them believe that Putin's an evil, ambitious tyrant who is seeking to take over Europe. There's no evidence of that at all. None. There's nothing in which she said. I mean, the only threat, as far as I can see, to NATO comes from the United States, not from Russia. But yes, I'm afraid that they do. And I think I'm reminded of the work of Schopenhauer, who said that that truth has three stages. The first is that it's ridiculed. The second is that it's violently opposed. And the third, that it's taken as self-evident. And I think in things like the Russia-Ukraine war or energy, at the moment, the idea that the Europeans at the moment have gone past the stage of ridicule for where the Russia-Ukraine war is, and they're now into the stage of violently opposing what is in self-evident truth. Whereas I think the Americans tacitly have actually said, okay, we've lost this war. European leaders don't seem to be able to face it. But I think that also goes true for other areas, including in energy. And in energy, there's a lot of misplaced thinking in energy. This is my job, and so I've been doing it for the last 15 years. I'm a bit of an energy nerd, but there's very poor understanding, even within some energy sectors, of the global energy situation, how important it is to all societies, Pascal.
This is one of the things. I mean, Russia, I don't know, like, much of the discussion, much of the discourse we also read in mainstream media is all about cutting off the financial resources for Putin to fund his war, the financial resources. And I go like, oh, but they have the oil that they need in order to run the economy. They have the manpower they need, and the woman power too, 140 million or so in total. They have the natural resources to create all of these things. Doesn't it at some point dawn on these people that the real economy, the factors of production, all inside Russia? The money question is a question of organization. How do you motivate people to sit at the factory lines, right, and to do that? But it's not a real problem in that sense. I really wonder. At least the military people like you, wouldn't that like just dawn on them that, oh no, they have everything they need to fight a war? The money is not really the issue.
You're absolutely right. It's difficult, but there's a difference between thinking in the financial and the economic world and thinking in the real industrial and physical world. And you're right, Russia is what's known as an autarkic economy, which is that it's self-sufficient. And if it can't sell its energy to Europe, which it probably no longer will now, and I suspect those energy supplies are cut off to Europe forever. I might be wrong. I'd like to think I'm wrong. But actually, it's got lots of opportunity to sell them, of course, to China and to India. There's some very interesting analysis I saw done about sort of 10 years ago, I think, which suggested that actually by the early 2030s, that India and China, with their populations, would consume all of the world's exportable oil. So you can ask the question there, well, so what for Europe? And of course, people in Europe will say, well, that's fine, we'll just transition to renewable energy. I mean, I work in the energy sector, and it's a fantasy the transition, even if it is possible, and I don't think it is, even if it's possible, will take 50 to 100 years. So the idea that we can transition, because hydrocarbons currently make up 80% of the global energy supply, with about 10% to nuclear and 10% to renewables, including hydroelectricity. And the idea that you can transition 80% from 80% to zero is fantasy. If we can do it, and I very much doubt we can, then when I last calculated that we did do it, working on our current progress, we'll hit net zero in the year 2260.
Yeah, but I mean, those are all good points. But my issue is on an even more fundamental level, that even if you manage to cut off Russia completely from all exports, let's say it cannot export a single drop of oil, the worst thing that happens to Russia is that it has too much oil. It's like, really, that's it. Because even the idea, oh, then they don't have money. It's like, I'm sorry, but Russia even makes its own rubles, right? Like any sovereign state, except for the EU. But let's leave that thing aside. The war making capacity is not an issue of the oil exports, but yet the Europeans and the UK too is like, they're so fixated on that and seem to think that if Russia can be punished in that area, then in the end the war will be turned around. But this is, at this point, I mean, even the Americans, I think, understand, no, that's not what it is.
I think the Americans have got this. I can see it in the national security strategy. It's clear that they're trying to reestablish a relationship with Russia. It's going to be a very chaotic establishment of that relationship, but I suspect that they'll get there eventually. But no, you're quite right. I mean, militarily, you can't throw collateralized synthetic debt obligations against the Russians and assume that they're going to win the war. You can't throw loans at the Russians and expect that they're going to win the war. Russia is outproducing the whole of the West in 155 millimeter shells. Russia is developing hypersonic missiles against which we have no defense. Not we in Ukraine, we in Europe. One of my jobs in the Navy was to command an air defense destroyer. So I was a specialist in air defense, and I can tell you that I would be surprised if in 10 years we have an ability to defend against the hypersonic missiles that Russia has produced. So, we're in a situation where for those reasons, and no matter how hard that the Europeans, with American support, try to punish Russia, the likelihood is that it'll have the reverse effect. I wrote an article for the Naval Review about, in September of 23, I think it was, no, September of 22, and I said that the sanctions were boomerang sanctions. They were going to have much more deleterious impact on European nations than they would on Russia. And so and it was obvious at the time, Pascal. So it's very difficult to understand how people can, elite leaders and elite teams of officials, civil servants, military officers, politicians, can miss things which seem to me and to you and to others in the alternative voices just self-evident. The truth is arriving.
The truth is,
yeah,
truth is arriving. The big question is whether we have the capacity to actually realize it, right? And then work with it in a constructive way. And just maybe just 2 points. First one, I wonder why it is that all the political talk and also military talk is always about deterrence and how to make sure that the Russians can't attack, instead of the question about how to make sure that the Russians don't want to attack. I mean, for instance, the neutrality of Ukraine or neutrality in general is usually a debate about how to create an arrangement that nobody wants to come and get something. And of course, that includes a deterrence factor as well. But that is one thing. The other thing then that I would like you to talk about is your other area of expertise about strategy. And well, the absence of strategy in the West, and maybe also the strategy that of the Russians, how you think they are approaching this issue. But please pick among these things what you would like to talk about.
I think your point on deterrence is a really important point, and I'll come to it at the end if I may. But I have for some time been thinking about the Russia strategy, and when I wrote the book, it was called Strategy for Action. And I wrote it because we were so bad at it, but I increasingly came across so much strategic thinking that was in the past and forgotten that I realized that actually we could get a lot better at it. And you can do it in a quite structured way. And so I tend to think I've sort of self-taught, if you like, on strategy. But what's terribly disappointing is that the teaching in the West is appalling. I mean, it's obvious it's appalling. We're now into the fifth failed interventional war. If you take the Russia-Ukraine war, following on from Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and Syria. The way that I've been looking at the Russian strategy, and I came at this in a neutral way because I hadn't anticipated Russia's intervention in the Donbass. But I came at it sort of really what I call from first principles, and it seemed to me as I began to sort of think it through that there was a sort of, if you like, a five-phase strategy. The preparation for that really was the Maidan Revolution, the early Minsk conversations, then taking you towards the intervention. But at phase one, which was the intervention, it was which I think ran from February to April 2022. I call that diplomatic pressure because I think that what the Russians were doing in that phase was seeking a negotiated solution. And we know
yes.
Putin talked immediately, I think within a day, to actually start to do that. And I thought the two parts of that was that moving into the Donbass with a force which was obviously not big enough to take Ukraine. I cannot think that it was 190,000, of which quite a large proportion were Donbass volunteers. So it was obvious militarily that could not be enough to take Ukraine. So there was never in my mind an intention to take Ukraine, because you'd have needed a force which would be significantly larger than that. We're talking 500,000, perhaps bigger than that. So I can't think for one moment that the Russian general staff would have told Putin that, yes, we can take the whole of Ukraine with 190,000 troops. I think it was to actually secure the Donbass, and the second part of it was to actually put political pressure through the thrust towards Kiev. And by doing that, to actually probably as well, just to show the West that when the Russians said this was a red line, they meant it. So they weren't bluffing. I think phase two, they began to realize after the Biden-Johnson intervention that they would have to fight. And that because they were configured to fight a war against not only Ukraine, but NATO, they conducted what we would call a retreating contact. So it was a strategic withdrawal from the areas to the east of Kiev back to the Donbass, and to withdraw behind what's known as the Surovikin line. And that Surovikin line was built and extremely impregnable is the way that I would describe it. But at the same time, they began a military mobilization. And I think at the time, I remember that I think they were talking about a 30-month military mobilization. So in phase three, which was from October 22 to September 24, they're involved in what I would call attritional defense. So the Ukrainians were persuaded by Western generals and Western staff officers, attacked the Surovikin line not once but twice. They did that without aviation support, without air support, and without all of the things that you would want in any chance to get through a line of that impregnability, if you like. And surprise, surprise, they suffered significant casualties. So the Russians, I think their objective at that stage was not to secure territory. It was to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine, as indeed they've been telling us ever since the war started. And ironically, the West were actually helping them, because they're helping them by encouraging the Ukrainians to throw troops and military equipment at the Surovikin line and have it destroyed. So it's a sad thing to say, but that's how the demilitarization was being achieved. Now, I think from around about September 24, the Russians then shifted into what I call phase four, which was where they're actually into what I call offensive attrition, which is moving slowly forward whilst at the same time attriting the materiel and the men of the Ukrainian armed forces. I think they wanted to secure I'm sure, to secure the Donbass and then the four eastern territories. But the idea that they're moving slowly because it was poor generalship by the Russian staff is fantasy. They're moving slowly because it suited the strategy and it's what they wanted to achieve. So when you hear people say they were already achieving, very small territorial seizure. Didn't matter. What they're wanting to do was to actually attrit the Ukrainian armed forces.
Yeah.
And I think that takes us to where we are now. And I think the final phase, which is the one that I think we're just ending, is what I call strategic exploitation. And I think now that they will be shifting from demilitarization, because not completely, because they're still attriting down Ukrainian armed forces, but they'll be looking to establish what they believe they need territorially to secure their to meet Russia's security needs. And I think there's a minimalist side. The minimalist side it will be the four eastern oblasts, but the maximalist side, and I think this is the way they'll go, is Novorossiya. So this is New Russia, which includes Odessa and the those oblasts which are just on the west and east of the Dnieper River, and I think that will connect them to Transnistria. It will also secure Odessa, which in turn means that there are no avenues for Ukraine to attack them from in a maritime way. And that will achieve their security needs. And my strong intuition is that Putin has said, we will keep going with this. He's told his general staff, we'll keep going with this. If there is a diplomatic initiative or works for us, plan B, then that's fine, and we can look at it at the time. But until you hear more from me, keep going with this, and we'll see where we've got to when we've secured Novorossiya.
Yeah, and I think here it's really important to point out that Vladimir Putin said so much. He said so openly. He said so on TV, saying like, "Look, we prefer a military solution, but if we can get the same diplomatically, then we will not shut that down." That's why they're still talking and have a diplomacy actually with the Americans. On the other hand, there's also, I mean, in Russia and in Brussels, and I mean the headquarters of NATO, I'm pretty sure they're both on the same page when it comes to the realization that this is a proxy war, right? And both of them are kind of fine of fighting it in Ukraine because it's not just the Ukrainian military that's being degraded, right? I mean, Russia has been degrading the entire NATO equipment. It has, to a large part, defanged not everything, but a part of NATO, like the offensive kind of in-your-face military trenches kind of part, has been defanged to a large degree. So militarily speaking, this was something achieved, and I very much think Vladimir Putin actually, and the Russian leadership in general, thinks in processes, not in policy so much. And in processes are, again, similar to the way that ships move, right? You try to figure out what you need to do now in order for the thing to go in one or the other direction, and you try to take into consideration not only what your own ship is capable of doing, but also how the sea moves in order to figure out how you can maneuver. And in this sense, it seems to me that at least the Russians have decided to try to move the ship into a way of securing Russia from the European mainland. What I'm not sure about is the Europeans, whether and NATO, whether their strategy now is to accept that and then let it come to an end, or if actually they want to escalate to the European level, and say like, no, we now going to prepare in order to have a full-blown European war against Russia. What do you see there? Because in Germany, we see the militarization going on. We hear it in the UK, and we hear the saber rattling, right? So, but is it real or is it show? And actually, this whole thing will grind to a halt at some point.
I suspect that it will grind to a halt, and I suspect it will grind to a halt for reasons which people don't realize initially, but which is I suspect that we won't be able to afford it. So I suspect that with heavily indebted Western nations, I mean, I think with the possible exception of Germany, but it probably won't take long. All of the G7 nations have debt to GDP ratios which are in excess of 100%. America's heading towards 125%. It's that sort of level, even higher in other places. So the question is, where does the money come from? And of course, the only place the money comes from is from taxpayers. Now, as it becomes clear that
I have a slightly different take on this one. Sorry, I just need to throw out the money comes from ultimately the money comes from the central bank. Again, I don't believe that money, and I don't believe that debt is that much of a constraining factor. At the end of the day, anyone's debt is somebody else's asset. So you can always make money out of that. But the Europeans don't have the infrastructure, right? And they don't have the things in order to make that stuff.
It's a fair point. I think what they certainly don't have is the industrial capacity to match Russia's. I mean, and it should be clear to everybody that if this war cannot be won with America on board, the United States on board, then it certainly can't be won with just the Europeans. So I would the way that I'm hearing people talking about being ready to fight Russia by 2030 and to get their investments in by 2030. All of the economies are struggling. We're already seeing the Germany is in recession. I think Britain and France are on the verge of recession, if they're not actually in recession, with very, very tepid growth. I think 0.1%, it's tiny. But I think the industrial capacity is critical. The other critical thing, and again, I would say this, wouldn't I, as an energy person, is where did the energy come from? So, and this is nothing to do with finance, as you say. So in the article in which I wrote about balance of power, I said that not only do you need industrial capacity, you need energy. Because in factories don't work very well if there's no electricity and nothing to fire them. So at the moment, the Europeans are net importers of hydrocarbons to around about 12 million barrels a day. I think it's that sort of figure. It's a very high figure. And with the single exception of Norway, all are net importers. Now, the problem that's going to happen, I suspect, is that as they cut off the hydrocarbon opportunity from Russia, then where does that energy come from? You've got expensive LNG from the States, and you've got expensive LNG and less expensive from Qatar, and that's about it.
And may I tell you a secret? That very expensive LNG from the United States, I'm not sure if that's still coming if they actually want Greenland and the Europeans don't say yes. I'm not sure. I mean, could it be that Donald Trump might weaponize LNG? I mean, just a little secret. Because the Europe we don't want to ruin the party of the Europeans, right?
I mean, that LNG as well is mostly would have to check this proportions, but a high proportion of it is from the shale sector, because it's what shale produces energy. And shale is it's a very short-term resource. People don't realize, but a shale field goes to maximum production in 6 months, but within about 24 months, it's down to about 10%, and it's out by 30 months. With one exception, most of the shale fields in the I think it's the Bakenfield is still the one, or it might be the Eagle Ford, which are still the ones which are actually producing, but a lot of them in decline. So shale is not, it's a very high energy return on energy investment, or very low energy return on energy investment resource. And it's a short-term thing. That I happen to think is one of the reasons why America is actually in Venezuela. But no, you're right. You know, if Europe does not have the energy to fire up its factories, even if it could afford to get these factories up and running, then the chance of it being ready to confront Russia, even by 2030, I'd say are extremely slim. You know, Russia has a start of probably 2 to 3 to 4 years. It is also an industrialized society and not a financialized society. So for those reasons, that I would be astonished that we could ever catch up with Russia, even if we were putting, for example, something like 10% of our GDP into military industrialization. And of course, the irony is that Russia don't want to take Europe. We would be fighting an offensive war against Russia, and it would be like like the Ukrainians fighting against the Surovikin line. And for what purpose? I mean, the irony is that people say to me, "Oh, well, Putin obviously wants to take Europe." And my response is, why would he want to take Europe? What's there here in Europe that he would want? You know, he has an autarkic society. He has all the energy he needs. Industrialized society. What possible reason would he want to take Europe? I mean, it's well known from historical analysis that the Russians didn't actually enjoy too much sometimes being the leader of the USSR, and that actually it was quite fractious working with some of the Eastern European countries. I can think of no reason why the Russians would want to take Europe, and there is no evidence in anything that Putin has ever said that they do. That they do. Indeed, everything that they've said is the reverse. So this is a Western fantasy, I'm afraid.
This entire discourse just reminds me of, like, the it's just narcissism at the end of the day. It's like, we the garden, and Mr. Borrell even said so, right, in a very racist way. We the garden, and everybody wants to get into the garden, and or even get the garden for themselves. It's like, guys, did you ever look around? Like, what do your cities look like? Did you ever look around what your economy looks like? Yeah, I mean, out of touch, out of touch. That's why this discourse with Russia makes so little sense in our corner, right? It would make much more sense to say, like, hey, how can we sit down and build that cooperative security structure from Portugal to Vladivostok in order to make sure that we can all prosper and Ukraine can be a bridge instead of a wall. I mean, that would make much more sense, but that occurs in no corners of the public discourse, the mainstream discourse.
I think it's one of these things where you said asked about Europe's strategy. I don't think Europe has a strategy. I'm a writer on strategy. I've been thinking about it heavily for the last 20 years. I can see no sign of any strategy in Europe other than double down and hope. So that's it's disastrous, frankly, because it's stopping us. It's stopping us think clearly about it. We're in this cult thinking, which means that anybody who, people like Jacques Bord, for example, who dares to actually produce very well-referenced work. I read his books. They're exceptionally well-referenced, and they're very, very analytically sound, in my view. But because he's saying something that our politicians don't agree with, then he's silenced. This is very bad for Europe, because actually we're actually damaging ourselves economically. It's a time when we really should be thinking about investing in capital expenditures, which are for the benefit of society, as opposed to trying to fight on to win an unwinnable war or prepare for a bigger unwinnable war on the continent of Europe. You're right, and that in terms of the discussion about deterrence, I have for some time been saying that NATO has been talking about deterrence, but what NATO has actually been doing in practice is confrontation. So it's not deterrence, it's confrontation. And they've been in a confrontational situation with Russia where they marched up to the borders. That turned out it was a bluff. I don't think we realized it was a bluff. And I wrote an article, I think this was for Responsible Statecraft about 9 months ago, in which I said that NATO was something of a paper tiger, and that if NATO, even with America, was on board, was in a war with Russia, we would lose. I'm absolutely sure that we would lose for a number of reasons. But actually, again, NATO is one of these things where it's an institution, a bit like a supranational institution, a bit like the European Union, where they become one of the key elements or the key drivers in the institution is its own self-preservation.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid that actually, I think the key casualties of the war could be NATO and could be the European Union as independent institutions. It would not surprise me at all within 5 years if both have disappeared.
Yep, that's very well on the cards, I believe. I would like to run by you a theory or an approach that a young researcher has, who was on my channel a couple of times, Nel Bonilla. She's a fantastic analyst, I think, and she's trying to piece things together. And in one of her latest approaches, she talks about what she calls the Securitocracy. Her argument is that, look, it looks chaotic and it looks disjointed and it looks like bad leadership, but actually what we're seeing is the shift of the way that our states are run away from politics, away from politicians themselves, because they become just like the implementation figures, to do what has been already lined out by the Securitocracy, the people who work in think tanks, who work in these administrative bodies and so on, and think about the world and politics purely in terms of security, and then subsume everything under the label of security. So everything's a war, everything needs to be defended, everything needs to be approached as a cognitive warfare, human warfare, like and hence every aspect of life needs to be somehow integrated into a military plan, into a defensive structure, and also resources. Not 1% of GDP, not 2, but 5% need to go into that and need to be distributed into infrastructure that are all supposed to help us to be secure without ever defining what the endpoint of security is. When are we secure? It just defines enemies against which then security must be produced. How much do you see that influence, of this securitocrats that try to argue at any point in time that we need to increase security in all levels?
Yeah, I do see a bit of it. I certainly see a bit of it in the press, and I suppose in a way it's a bit like Eisenhower's warning about military-industrial complex, and so I think there's some of that in it. I think actually it has a fundamental flaw, which is it's the guns and butter argument, which is that actually societies can only, if they are going to invest in security, then actually if that ultimately ends up in destroying economies or meaning that the economies are less economically successful, then it's self-defeating. I mean, it's obvious that actually if you spend all your time and all your money on guns as opposed to the essentials of food, energy, and so on, then actually you're going to end up with a less secure society. And indeed, a society with a Securitocracy will be needed because of the breakdown in order of the society. I mean, we're already seeing lots of stresses and strains across Europe with riots in places. So, it concerns me. But I think that's a very interesting. I hadn't come across that thinking, but I'll make sure that I read more into it. But I think the interesting issue there is the extent to which there is a financial stroke capitalistic issue there, which is that the influence of the military-industrial complex in terms of policy, largely speaking for reasons of shareholder interest. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if that's an element. In other words, you've got, I was listening on the BBC, have a Sunday politics program, and there was a CEO of a defense company on their large defense company who again was arguing for more investment in security. Of course he would. Of course he would, purely from shareholder interest. I think that the danger there is that actually we need to actually think about this in a much more balanced way, because there is another way to do security, which is actually talking to people. And so if you ask me, what would I replace NATO with? I'd replace it straight away with an organization which isn't perfect, but the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And the clue to the way it works is in the word cooperation. And I think actually one of the best ways in which we can be secure in Europe is actually start to talk again to the Russians. This is complete sort of, I find that people are dumbfounded about this, but I find it absolutely diplomatically incompetent that the Europeans aren't talking to Russia. We've talked to difficult conversations were kept going between both sides of wars for years and years. I mean, Vietnam was one example. The Northern Ireland problems that we had was another example. We talked to the IRA in very subtle ways throughout that conflict. But if we don't talk to Russia and try to understand the situation from their perspective, then we're likely to drive ourselves into a frenzy of securitocracy. We'll drive ourselves into a frenzy of investing more and more in defense and less in the fundamental needs of successful populations. It's about education, it's about food, it's about energy, and it's about the normal health and the normal needs to industrials of a sort of functioning Western society. This is one of the reasons why I suspect that the war won't come off, because I suspect that the way that we're going, if we keep going on this track, Pascal, then actually we will have done ourselves significant economic damage. We already have done ourselves significant economic damage, but the way we're going, we're actually going to double down on the damage that we're doing to ourselves by really poor strategic thinking about the war and about the broader context in which the war is happening and the consequences. And these consequences are foreseeable. I know they're foreseeable because I've foreseen them, you've foreseen them, other people have foreseen them. The problem is that the Western elites can't seem to foresee them at the moment. And that's why channels like this, which allow people the opportunity to have alternative thinking are so important. It's you, it's Doug McGregor, it's Daniel Davis, it's Glenn Deason. All of these sorts of channels are important because at the moment we are really, really struggling to get any sensible thinking in the mainstream media. We used to have really good press in this country, but I find it disappointing. I've complained a couple of times to the BBC, and I might as well have been. It's a bit like being in a Alice in Wonderland world. Indeed, I begin to wonder whether I should be rereading Alice in Wonderland to have an understanding of what's going on in the elites.
It's I mean, this is part of the big question, right? How come that in liberal democratic states we end up with a completely captured elite captured mainstream media. I mean, and there are explanations. We have Chomsky and Herman. We have a lot of discussions. I had discussions on this channel. I think we can all figure out the mechanisms that lead to this, but the conflagration of all of it that then goes together with an external war, with internal repressions of the way that now, especially the UK, deals with dissent on Gaza and on Palestine, on the genocide. I mean, it's draconian, right? Where protesters are being protest is being criminalized and so on. So there's just so many aspects to this, but they all point into the direction of just more of the same and doubling down of the system on insisting on this way, even at a moment when the biggest partner, the United States, basically is the only real threat to European territory, to NATO territory, it's quite fantastic, actually, if you think about it. And in a sense, I wouldn't be happy if Donald Trump does it, but it would deserve them, right? It's like if your biggest ally takes away a very big chunk of EU territory, it's maybe that's the wake-up call needed in order to kind of get rid of some of these basic ideas of this cult thinking.
There's I was brought on to cult thinking by a guy called Livesey. I've forgotten his first name actually, but he writes about postmodernism. And one of the things that we're suffering from, there are two dynamics, I think, in Western societies. Firstly, we've been people call it woke, but it's better to understand it as postmodernism because it actually much better explains what's going on. The other, I think, is what I would call the sort of the Chicago school economists. So you've got people on the left and the right, both damaging our societies, curiously. But I think that I think it was Eisenhower said the most important thing for a functioning democracy was a well-informed populace, and we certainly do not have that at the moment. And it's largely speaking due to I think it's due to a culture of spin and the way that political parties and those in power seek to manipulate the press. But it's also due, I think, to the press who want access, and they're conscious that if they are rabidly anti the governments in power, that the access that they will get may be closed off. And it's partly that, but also I think it's partly because also they too are captured by the spin. It's very interesting that in cults, that one of the things you find is that when facts and figures destroy the argument of the cult, they simply re-rationalize to explain the facts and figures in a way which actually fits the feelings of the cult. And we see that time and again, I'm afraid. We will get through it, and I think we will get through it as truth arrives. And I think the first big truth is going to be the defeat of Ukraine in the Russia-Ukraine war, and I suspect that will have happened by the end of next year. I doubt it'll be before that. It might go on into 27. But it's at that stage where I think a lot of Western populations are going to be looking at their politicians and their elites and saying, how did you get this wrong? And the answer is really, really simple. There's a very good French general called André Beaufray, who was writing in the 50s. And he said that in war, the loser deserves to lose because his defeat will be a consequence of poor thinking, poor strategic thinking, either before or during the war. And that's exactly the diagnosis that I would give people if I were asked by my politicians about why things are going wrong.
Yeah.
It really is that simple, I'm afraid.
I mean, you can ignore the iceberg until it hits you. You can still ignore it, but you will sink. And once you're at the bottom of the ocean, you can call yourself you were a beautiful ship. But no, you can't because you're going to be dead. Period. So
the Americans have jumped off the Titanic. The Europeans are still on it and making more and more holes, I'm afraid. So
yeah, the music is playing ever louder, but it's just to be louder than the iceberg. Then the scratching, because the scratches get like really, really loud now. Okay. Stephen, people who want to find your work or your writing, where should they follow you?
I've got a couple of articles which I'll send you, which they can see. I'm actually developing a Substack, so I'll send you the links to that as well. And I'm hoping to launch YouTube in the middle of the year, Pascal. So I'll update you. But great, it's been a pleasure, Pascal, and well done for all you do as well. It's really, really important.
Well, thank you very much for that, and thank you for giving us your analysis. I will put the links that you will send me into the description of this video below. Commodore Steve Jermy, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Pascal.